last segment, we trailed off, as it were, with the political history of what we call the Holy Land. More important, however, was the spiritual history of the Kingdom of Israel, where they lost complete political control of their lands. Nevertheless, the house of David retained the Davidic covenant. And eventually, in the fullness of time, one of their members, who was a member both on his adoptive foster fathers and on his mother's side, succeeded to the throne of his fathers. Who was he? Jesus Christ, the God-man, the second person of the Holy Trinity. He was king, not just of the Jews, not just of the nascent church, but of all mankind and of all the universe. And from him stems all rightful authority to be used for the common good. Salvation of souls, that is to say, divinization of souls, the presence of each individual with him in the beatitude for eternity, the temporal means of assisting and providing that immense power. As time went on, various countries became Christian, and finally the empire in 380 AD became wholly so. From that time on, this Catholic kingship, which was seen in the Christian empire and in those barbarian nations that became Christian, was itself a participation in the kingship of Christ. And what did this mean? Well, what it meant, and this would go on all the way to the Reformation, what it meant was that a monarch who wanted to be considered legitimate by his people had to take authority from God via the church and wield his powers, whatever they were, according to the requirements of that legitimacy, i.e., the common good. So the king had the power to do something terrible, as the Pope did, and he could, but while he had the power to do so, he didn't have the right. And so we come into an area that becomes very, very important for considering any number of things. We have to ask ourselves, and I think it's a fair question, we have to ask ourselves, what is the common good? What is it governance is supposed to be aiming toward? There has been a lot of argument in the last decade anyway, between post-liberals and integralists and so on about the common good. But really, it is what was said before. Anything that contributes to the salvation of a people, that is a legitimate use of authority and power. What does not conduce toward that is not. So, for instance, any attempt by someone like Henry VIII to suppress the Catholic truth in his area was in and of itself an invalid law, because it was an invalid use of authority and an invalid use of power. Now, mind you, nobody doubted that he had the means to bring about the separation from Rome, for example, but he did not have the right to do so. He did not have the authority to do so. He misused his power, and he misused his authority as king to push this through. And that was done throughout the lands of the Reformation. Keep this in mind. Henry VIII and many other rulers like him sent hundreds, if not thousands, of Catholics to their deaths in witness of the truth of the Catholic faith. Henry VIII and those kings did not have the authority to do so. They were wrong to do so. That was not why God gave the King of England or the King of Sweden or the King of Denmark the authority to be king. The fact that they had the power to misuse their authority, well, that is an unfortunate truth of human history and an all too common one. Suffice to say that the way in which those in power carry out their deeds is sometimes just as important as the deeds themselves. No good authority will do more than fail if they use an immoral means or an immoral mode of action. But sometimes powers become truly deeply implanted amongst people who have no right to them. When the Protestant revolt split Europe, many, not just kings and princes, but dukes and marquises and barons, declared themselves Protestant, seized church lands which had gone to the use of the common good for time immemorial, and threw them over to their own purposes. Sometimes, some of them, they would turn to educational institutions and things like that. But for the most part, they gave them to their cronies or kept them. So this misuse of authority contributed greatly to the religious strife of the 15 and 1600s. It became triumphant in several quote-unquote heroic figures. Oliver Cromwell, for instance, was the foremost apostle of power over authority. We can see this in his campaigns, in his career in Scotland and Ireland, as well as in England. The many murders he indulged in, and so forth. These terrible conflicts through the 17th century would be topped by the revolutions of the 18th century. And now we come to a very interesting thing, and that is the emergence of what we would call modern Republican government. The problem with modern Republican government is that of its essence, the common good cannot be a part of what it aims toward. Why? Because inevitably, republics produce factions, and factions want their good, not the good of society as a whole. Very, very few are the republics where it was otherwise. Now, every political set of people stay in office just as long as they can milk their country for their own supporters' ends. But that is not, by any means, that is not the common good. And that brings us to the great problems of our time. Because without the common good, why do we have government? Well, that's so somebody can be in charge and smack the rest of us around. No, we must believe that authority and governance have a higher good, which is the spiritual and temporal well-being of man. If they don't, then nothing is any better than the revolutions which overthrew not only kings but republics and resulted in the murders of thousands, if not millions. And why not? Why shouldn't they? Because in a world where authority does not control power, might truly makes right. Hitler and Stalin, Lenin, Mao, all these guys, they didn't worry about legitimacy or authority. They had power. That's all they needed. Well, yes and no. Because authority, rather, supplemented from its traditional elements, tends to decay. The exercise of power by those interested only in self-interest and in the aggrandizement of their allies and their friends is, in fact, a concomitant, there's a word for you, a concomitant, of what we consider modern Republican government. All the revolutions that brought the various modern states into being confused authority and power, and inevitably subjugated, not immediately, but after a while, would subjugate the most creative minorities, and sometimes not so creative minorities, to those who had control already and wanted more. So the result was a system that we have today, that we had until recently, the American-Soviet diarchy, where you had two countries which between them controlled the planet, and neither of whom really believed in the common good. The United States had a sort of common good that was very nebulous. But as long as the Soviet Union was there as a great example of dictatorship, the United States were obligated to, the rulers of the United States were obligated to rule their subjects as wisely as they could and to use their power judiciously. When they simply became the Russians simply became a communist oligarchy, well, all of that vanished. But we'll see what happened next after we return.